The first week, you remember when we were talking about pushing the fat man off the bridge, someone said, but he didn't agree to sacrifice himself. It would be different if he consented. Or when we were talking about the cabin boy, killing and eating the cabin boy, some people said, well, if they had consented to a lottery, it would be different. Then it would be all right. So consent has come up a lot. And here in John Locke, we have one of the great philosophers of consent. Consent is an obvious, familiar idea in moral and political philosophy. Locke says that legitimate government is government founded on consent, and who nowadays would disagree with him? Sometimes when the ideas of political philosophers are as familiar as Locke's ideas about consent, it's hard to make sense of them, or at least to find them very interesting. But there are some puzzles, some strange features of Locke's account of consent as the basis of legitimate government. And that's what I'd like to take up today. One way of testing the plausibility of Locke's idea of consent, and also of probing some of its perplexities, is to ask just what a legitimate government founded on consent can do. What are its powers according to Locke? Well, in order to answer that question, it helps to remember what the state of nature is like. Remember, the state of nature is the condition that we decide to leave, and that's what gives rise to consent. Why not stay there? Why bother with government at all? Well, what's Locke's answer to that question? He says there are some inconveniences in the state of nature, but what are those inconveniences? The main inconvenience is that everyone can enforce the law of nature. Everyone is an enforcer, or what Locke calls the executor of the state of nature. And he means executor literally. If someone violates the law of nature, he's an aggressor, he's beyond reason, and you can punish him. And you don't have to be too careful or fine about gradations of punishment in the state of nature. You can kill him. You can certainly kill someone who comes after you, tries to murder you. That's self-defense. But the enforcement power, the right to punish, everyone can do the punishing in the state of nature. And not only can you punish with death people who come after you, seeking to take your life, you can also punish a thief who tries to steal your goods, because that also counts as aggression against the law of nature. If someone has stolen from a third party, you can go after him. Why is this? Well, violations of the law of nature are an act of aggression. There is no police force, there are no judges, no juries. So everyone is the judge in his or her own case. And Locke observes that when people are the judges of their own cases, they tend to get carried away. And this gives rise to the inconvenience in the state of nature. People overshoot the mark, there's aggression, there's punishment, and before you know it, everybody is insecure in the enjoyment of his or her unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. Now, he describes in pretty harsh and even grim terms what you can do to people who violate the law of nature. One may destroy a man who makes war upon him for the same reason that he may kill a wolf or a lion. Such men have no other rule but that of force and violence. Listen to this. And so may be treated as beasts of prey, those dangerous and noxious creatures that will be sure to destroy you if you fall into their power. So kill them first. So what starts out as a seemingly benign state of nature where everyone's free, and yet where there is a law, and the law respects people's rights, and those rights are so powerful that they're unalienable. What starts out looking very benign, once you look closer, is pretty fierce and filled with violence, and that's why people want to leave. How do they leave? Well, here's where consent comes in. The only way to escape from the state of nature is to undertake an act of consent where you agree to give up the enforcement power and to create a government or a community where there will be a legislature to make law, and where everyone agrees in advance, everyone who enters agrees in advance to abide by whatever the majority decides. But then the question, and this is our question, and here's where I want to get your views, then the question is, what powers, what can the majority decide? Now here it gets tricky for Locke, because you remember, alongside the whole story about consent and majority rule, there are these natural rights, the law of nature, these unalienable rights. And you remember, they don't disappear when people join together to create a civil society. So even once the majority is in charge, the majority can't violate your inalienable rights, can't violate your fundamental right to life, liberty, and property. So here's the puzzle. How much power does the majority have? How limited is the government created by consent? It's limited by the obligation on the part of the majority to respect and to enforce the fundamental natural rights of the citizens. They don't give those up. We don't give those up when we enter government. That's this powerful idea taken over from Locke by Jefferson in the Declaration. Unalienable rights. So, let's go to our two cases. Remember Michael Jordan, Bill Gates, the libertarian objection to taxation for redistribution? Well, what about Locke's limited government? Is there anyone who thinks that Locke does give grounds for opposing taxation for redistribution? Anybody? Go ahead.
If the majority rules that there should be taxation, even if the minority should still not have to be taxed, because that's taking away property, which is one of the rights of nature.
All right, so, and what's your name? Ben. So, if the majority taxes the minority without the consent of the minority to that particular tax law, it does amount to a taking of their property without their consent, and it would seem that Locke should object to that. Do you want some textual support for your view, for your reading of Locke, Ben? All right. I brought some along just in case you raised it. If you have your texts, look at 138, passage 138. The supreme power, by which Locke means the legislature, cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent, for the preservation of property being the end of government, and that for which men enter into society, it necessarily supposes and requires that people should have property. That was the whole reason for entering society in the first place, to protect the right to property. And when Locke speaks about the right to property, he often uses that as a kind of global term for the whole category, the right to life, liberty, and property. So that part of Locke, at beginning of 138, seems to support Ben's reading. But what about the part of 138, if you keep reading? Men, therefore, in society having property, they have such a right to the goods which by the law of the community are theirs. Look at this. And that no one can take from them without their consent. And then at the end of this passage he says, so it's a mistake to think that the legislative power can do what it will and dispose of the estates of the subject arbitrarily or take any part of them at pleasure. Here's what's elusive. On the one hand, he says, the government can't take your property without your consent. He's clear about that. But then he goes on to say, I mean, that's the natural right to property. But then it seems that property, what counts as property, is not natural but conventional, defined by the government. The goods which by the law of the community are theirs. And the plot thickens if you look ahead to section 140. In 140 he says governments can't be supported without great charge. Government is expensive. And it's fit that everyone who enjoys his share of the protection should pay out of his estate. And then here's the crucial line. But still it must be with his own consent, i.e. the consent of the majority, giving it either by themselves or through their representatives. So what is Locke actually saying? Property is natural in one sense, but conventional in another. It's natural in the sense that we have a fundamental, unalienable right that there be property, that the institution of property exist and be respected by the government. So an arbitrary taking of property would be a violation of the law of nature and would be illegitimate. But it's a further question. Here's the conventional aspect of property. It's a further question what counts as property, how it's defined, and what counts as taking property, and that's up to the government. So the consent, here we're coming back to our question, what is the work of consent? What it takes for taxation to be legitimate is that it be by consent, not the consent of Bill Gates himself if he's the one who has to pay the tax, but by the consent that he and we, all of us within the society, gave when we emerged from the state of nature and created the government in the first place. It's the collective consent. And by that reading, it looks like consent is doing a whole lot, and the limited government consent creates isn't all that limited. Does anyone want to respond to that or have a question about that? Go ahead. Stand up.